Hey everyone, welcome to the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable brought to you by FantasyLabs. I'm Matthew Freedman, the editor-in-chief, and in this episode we're going to talk about Vegas and how to apply it to DFS, and we are joined by three very special guests. One of them is Sean Koerner at the _odds maker. He's the director of predictive analytics for Stats, the most accurate fantasy pros NFL ranker from 2013 to 2016, and a four-time FSTA winner for the most accurate player projections in NFL and MLB. He was on our NFL show a couple of times last season. Sean, how's it going?
I'm doing well. How about yourself? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always fun to have you on. No football season going on, so what are you doing with your spare time?
Just tilting over NBA, dabbling in some DFS golf, but getting ready for MLB, and I have some March Madness projects I'm involved in, so this is still a pretty busy time for me, but yeah, enjoying the NFL offseason.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine a true degenerate can always find a way to keep himself busy.
Oh yeah, no, I'm a true degenerate for sure.
All right, well, it's good to have you back. And then also joining us and making his roundtable debut is Rob Pasola at Rob Pizzola. He's the business manager for PredictionMachine.com, and according to his Twitter profile, he is a plus EV sports bettor. If it's on Twitter, it must be true. Rich, how's it going?
It's going well. It's Twitter is a wasteland, and you can get all sorts of random stuff on there. But I do consider myself a positive expected value bettor. That's what I do. I try to beat betting lines and profit in the long term. So that's real. Since 2015, I've been betting on sports full time. So it's in the Twitter profile, but it's real. It's not made up or anything along those lines.
Awesome. Well, it's fantastic to have you on the show. And actually, you I think this last week you said you just recently met Jonathan Bales at the Sloan conference. So it's cool to have you on the show. And then returning to the roundtable is Jonathan Bales at Bales Football. He's the co-founder of FantasyLabs, the founder of Roto Academy, and the author of the Fantasy Sports for Smart People book series. Bales, you were recently at the 2017 MIT Sloan Sports Analytics Conference. How was it?
It was good. Yeah, I met Rob. He's a really sharp guy. I'm happy to be on the podcast with him. Sean, of course, watched him throughout NFL come on, and that was awesome. So, I feel like I'm probably the dumbest guy for sure on the podcast.
Oh, that's not true. But speaking of, I guess something that would be dumb at Sloan, did you and Mark Cuban have any like bench press competitions or anything like that?
No. So Peter talked to him. I could not get in. I did actually get in by accident. I didn't even know that I walked in, but I didn't have a pass. I tried to get it too late, and it's pretty hard to get in there. They sold out like a month beforehand, so I did not see Mark, but I believe Peter did.
All right. Well, it's good to have you on the show, and I would wager money, although I wouldn't be wagering it with any of you guys because you would take my money. I would wager money that Bales, you're not the dumbest person on the show. I think that I probably am, but let's get into it. And Sean, I'd like to start with you. You've actually worked in Vegas. You worked for a sports book, and then you still create projections for various sports. And so really so much of the work that Vegas does is predictive in nature. Can you talk about the process of creating lines and projections, and then what are the factors that you take into account? How do you go about determining which factors are important?
Yeah, so just to make a quick comparison between creating a line and projection, when you're going to create a betting line, you're going to come up with your own projection or estimate, but you ultimately want to predict what other people are going to think too. So you have to take that into account. But when it comes into projections, I'm just trying to come up with the best estimate as possible and try and take out, I don't factor in what if people are going to think my projection for Drew Brees is a little bit low. So when it comes to projections, I'm actually trying to, project the truth, so to speak. But when it comes to Vegas odds, they kind of have an advantage where they can kind of, have a best estimate, and then they let the betting market itself pretty much shape it. So that's why they're so accurate, is because the betting market itself help shape it. So, with my team at Stats, I try to do that with projections where I have other people, mainly Corey Schwartz, our top analyst, work with me and help shape them, because, when you only have one opinion or one input, you don't really get as accurate projections as you could with a little bit more of a, wisdom of the crowds effect. So, so I try to incorporate that element that makes Vegas so accurate into my projections as well.
Now, a follow-up question on that, because you touched on sort of the distinction between line making and doing projections. And I don't know if there's a way that you could answer this, but kind of like from a percentage basis or something like that, how important or how much do you think the analysis of what the betting market is going to do, or the public perception of a certain contest, how much of that do you think factors into the lines that are set versus the actual projection that a bookmaker might have?
These days it's both in the same. The market these days is very sharp. So, it's not like the 90s where you have an NFL team that's, a touchdown favorite, but in reality they're like -3. I think it's a lot closer to what a lot of computer models and a lot of the sharp odds makers themselves come up with. But I think it is a balancing act between the odds makers and the sharp bettors. I think people give a little too much credit to the odds makers themselves. They're just, they're coming up with initial estimate and have it shaped by the betting market. So there isn't really a set number that the odds maker thinks like, oh, this is exactly what it is. They kind of use the betting, not public, but the sharp bettors and the market itself to kind of see where it should be.
Well, on the topic there of kind of like computer models and things like that, we have Rob here from predictionmachine.com. Now, Rob, Prediction Machine has a simulation machine or a sports forecasting software. It's called the Predictolator, and that plays every game 50,000 times before it is actually played. So the technology takes into account the statistical interaction between players and coaches, officials, fans, weathers, just so many different factors. So I would imagine that Vegas has similar, though not identical, systems. Can you talk about the Predictolator and how you think it should be used?
Yeah, so it's interesting because everything Sean just said rings true. And when you talk about Vegas having identical systems, it's not really true. They put a line out there like Sean was mentioning, and then the betting market is going to shape that line and bring that line to where it actually should be. So what the Predictolator is just a Monte Carlo sim. It's a simulation method, and basically it assigns probabilities to the likelihood of outcomes happening in any event. So whether you're talking about player projections or straight up picks or against the spread picks or over under picks, totals, basically we're just putting a probability on that. Then we're going to compare that to the probability or the odds that are offered by sports books, and we're looking for edges there. So that's essentially the way to use the Predictolator, to use the prediction machine. We're just assigning probabilities on outcomes of games, comparing them to the sports books, and then we apply a Kelly criterion or any other sort of system of betting that you would use to capitalize on those games. So it's just a betting tool that you would use to beat the sports books and to beat lines and soft lines that are put out there early in the morning before they're shaped by the sharp bettors when the betting limits come off on those games.
Now, Bales, at FantasyLabs, we approach Vegas and projections from a fantasy sports angle. In your mind, is there any difference between projecting game and player outcomes for sports betting versus projecting fantasy sports?
Yeah, even in terms of the projections, I think there's some differences. So, an example might be in MLB, a player's spot in the order might not be incredibly important in terms of projecting the game or running a simulation on the game if they're of relatively the same talent level, but that's incredibly important in DFS where they're hitting. I think that Sean's point about DFS being because it's peer-to-peer, that you're so concerned about what other people are doing and trying to exploit that. I think that's the big difference for me. Sports betting to me is fundamentally about just like trying to get it right and trying to be as accurate as possible. In DFS, you're doing that in a way, but it's more exploiting maybe inefficiencies in the way that other people think, particularly in tournaments. So it's a combination of having a model and projecting things accurately, and then also thinking about the way that other people are thinking and trying to potentially exploit just biases in the way that they approach it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So for you, what you're looking to exploit is different in nature. So for Vegas, it would be that you're looking to exploit lines that the market hasn't reacted to correctly yet. And in DFS, you're looking to exploit more like the overreaction of the market to specific, we could call them lines, but specific salaries that have been set by the different platforms.
Yeah, and I think that what Sean said about it's probably changed. He would know, and Rob would know better than me. But it seems like probably Vegas tries to get it pretty accurate, and they are pretty accurate these days, especially with like say NFL spreads or something. Before it might have been like the weaknesses in the way that other people, that the public thought could influence the line, and you could try to exploit that. But probably now you're just mainly trying to jump on weak lines and trying to get it right in sports betting, whereas DFS is probably more like sports betting was in the 80s or 90s.
Mm-hmm. All right, so there are lots of ways to analyze the lines that Vegas sets. And Sean, we'll start with you here. How do you incorporate Vegas data into your analytical process? Like, do you rely on those lines first, or do you consult them later in the process?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above, really. I use them as an input in my model. So from start to finish. So I'm actually, incorporating the updated line throughout the day. But a lot of what I do in my models, I'm essentially making projections. So depending on sport, I'm using the Vegas odds, typically team total. Sometimes the spread can come into play. For baseball, win probability is huge for like the starting pitcher. But, I try to derive as much as I can from the Vegas odds. So for like football, it's going to be part of my touchdown projection for everybody. NBA, the team total. I try to get the team scale to the team total. Baseball, team total, win probability. But there is a point where you have to kind of stop. I see people maybe try to derive too much from it. You see things like, the Warriors have 110 team total. Vegas is saying stack the Warriors, but that's not true. Or in baseball, if a team total is 5, Vegas is saying stack that team. But what you really find is there's a reason why they're 5. They have a bunch of 4K hitters. So I do think people nowadays maybe try to derive a little too much from the Vegas odds, but I try to derive just the right amount and try to incorporate as much as I can. But there is some limits to it.
Mm-hmm. Rob, can you talk about how Vegas factors into what you guys do at Prediction Machine?
Yeah, to be honest with you, it doesn't really factor in a whole lot because, our sole goal is to actually beat odds makers and get out ahead of the market like I was talking about earlier. So, I tend to look at obviously how the market is moving over the course of the day. And if the market is moving against us, trying to figure out why that's happening, those are some things that I like to look at. But in terms of, how I'm specifically using, the odds that are put out there, I'm really not. Our models are making up for that. With that being said, everything Sean just said, those are all great points. And if for someone who doesn't have statistical forecasting models or doesn't model sports themselves, baseball pitcher wins, that's something that you can easily derive from a betting line. If you play DFS hockey and you're looking for goalie wins, that's something that can be easily derived from a betting line. Looking at team totals for games, these are all very important things. the market is very efficient. So if you are looking at this stuff later on in the day, and as the day goes on, you can definitely use all of this data that's available to you, just from the sharpest sports books, whether they're Pinnacle or Chris. You can use all that data and easily arrive at projections based on that data. So, essentially what I'm doing, what we're doing at Prediction Machine, we're not really using those tools because we're using our own forecasting software to try to beat those markets. But you will notice that as the day goes on and as time goes on, our forecasting models tend to align with the way that the lines move. So essentially while we're not using the Vegas numbers or the odds on the games, we're essentially using the same thing.
Yeah, that's really interesting there. So it's, in some ways, people can maybe even use it as something that can be predictive of where the lines will be later in the day. I mean, I'm not trying to put like words in your mouth, but it seems like that's something that could be possible.
Well, for us and for what we do, winning and losing is great. And we obviously track our winning and losing on everything, but we also track our closing line value. And basically what that is beating the lines, because if you bet a better number than the market, dictates that line should be later on in the day, and you continuously do that over time, you're going to win money. That's the sign of a good long-term bettor. And that's what I talked about earlier with, positive expected value. You continuously make wagers like that and the market moves your way, you're going to win. So, we track closing line value, and we view that just as important as winning and losing, because a lot of times there's a lot of randomness in sport. There's a lot of luck and variance over short periods of time. And you might have a bad month, but you might be doing everything right. And over the long term, that tends to balance itself out. So that's why, we do look at closing line value, and you're right. We that's sort of something that we look at and as the day goes on.
Mm-hmm. Bales, in terms of your DFS process, how do you use the Vegas data, and sort of like when does it figure into your process when you're making lineups? Do you rely on it early? How often do you rely on it? All of that stuff.
Yeah, it was really interesting to hear those guys talk about Vegas, and I think that, and I'm going to say something different. I think that we're all right, and it just depends on what your goals are. So Sean's are about projection accuracy, and it makes sense that he would incorporate Vegas for that. Rob is trying to beat Vegas, so obviously he's not going to use their lines to try to beat them. I primarily playing GPPs am trying to beat others, and I know that others in DFS, everyone pretty much, the first thing that you're taught is to use Vegas and use Vegas as a starting point. So many people do that. Sometimes that's really valuable. An example of that might be if you're playing cash in MLB, the money line for pitchers, like Sean said, the implied total, those things are really valuable. And probably you're going to want to be on the right side of that the majority of the time. The teams projected at 5.5 runs are going to score more than those at 4.5 runs over the long run. But day to day, there's a lot of volatility in that, and people overestimate it. And so if there's a 15% chance that a team at 5 runs will score a certain number of runs or be the top scoring team in a day, but they are 40% owned, then I care more about that. So I'm looking mainly for ways that people maybe are using the Vegas lines in ways that they shouldn't. Another might be that I think the spread is probably more important in football for defenses than implied team total. Implied team total is really predictive of ownership. People are just looking for who's going to allow the fewest points. And I think that for defenses, you probably just want pressure, get to the quarterback, and be up in the game to force the other team to throw a bunch. So if they give up a bunch of points, it doesn't necessarily matter. So really for me, it's looking for ways that other people are looking at Vegas that maybe isn't necessarily right for DFS.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Now, Rob, one thing that I read on Prediction Machine had to do with sample size. And so I'd like to get your thoughts on that. So in a perfect projection world, we could have a wealth of prior similar data, and we could have similar teams in similar circumstances. But obviously, I guess the more you hone in on trying to fit circumstances, the smaller the sample gets. So I'm wondering, how you balanced concerns of sample specificity with sample size.
Yeah, it seems obvious, but obviously the more data that you have, the more accurate that your projections or predictions are going to be. The numbers tend to prevail in the long term. A great deal of what happens in the short term or in very short sample sizes is a product of luck. So you definitely want to not limit your data sets and not limit your samples. The one thing that comes to my head immediately when I think of that is MLB and batter versus pitcher, and how some people, they really stand by batter versus pitcher stats, when I find it to be completely irrelevant. You're not really gaining anything out of 10 at bat sample sizes. I saw something on Twitter last year that absolutely tilted me when somebody was tweeting BVP numbers against Jake Arrieta. Well, Jake Arrieta, for a large part of his career, was a terrible pitcher, and now he's an elite pitcher. And there's a lot of pitchers that are like that in league, whether, it could be the complete opposite. A guy like Jared Weaver, who in his prime was fantastic, and now he throws an 80-mile-an-hour fastball and has a 6 ERA. It's completely different. So, small sample sizes, I just do away with them completely. I'm a guy that doesn't use a whole lot of splits. I tend to see a lot of home and away splits. I tend not to use that. I prefer the larger sample of using data as a whole. But there's some where you can't get away from it. Baseball, again, like lefty-righty splits. You can't get away from that. You can't just dismiss lefty and righty splits. They obviously matter in the grand scheme of things. But you want to be careful with, the 20 at-bat sample or the 30 at-bat sample against lefties. And maybe you want to incorporate previous years' worth of data in order to get a better judgment on a player or his projections going forward. So essentially, you just want to, you want to try not to limit yourself to a smaller sample of data. Sometimes it's impossible to do that, and you have to use what you work with, what you have, and you'll do some regressions and regress guys to the mean. But for the most part, I'm tending to try to keep those samples as big as possible to get an accurate projection.
Mm-hmm. Bales, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. And specifically, Rob mentioned splits. What are your thoughts on splits and then also sample size?
Yeah, he mentioned BVP. I agree. Don't think BVP is predictive. But outside of the examples that he mentioned, it's not that the data is meaningless. Ideally, if we had like a 500 at-bat sample of a batter versus a specific pitcher, we'd take that over versus a righty. So that data isn't necessarily, in theory, it's really good. We just don't have enough of it. So one thing that we do at labs with a few different metrics is sim scores, like a Pacoda style sim score methodology, particularly with ceiling floor. And I think that that's a decent way to get around the problem of you want to be as specific as possible. So BVP is as specific as you can be, but there's no sample, and then maybe just like overall numbers. That's the largest sample you can get, but not specific. And so you're trying to find some balance. And if you can find just generally good comps for a player in a specific situation, then maybe that's a good happy medium between those where you're getting ultimate accuracy.
Mm-hmm. Odds maker, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to my projection models and systems, I treat it as separate, and the sample size issue is more research I put into shaping my model. So for something like for basketball, for example, if Dwayne Wade is out and I want to adjust Jimmy Butler's points, rebounds, and assists, those kind of stats, I don't tend to just look at the games where Dwayne Wade is out. I have methods built into my system that tries to basically predict how he's going to see an increase in usage like that. And then I would look at, the smaller sample size as a reference, or maybe to hone in on the model itself. But I try not to rely on sample sizes like that because they can screw with my model a bit. So I'm basically seeing, in a whole, how certain stats interact, how predictive they are. So I'm usually not too concerned about the size of the sample in that regard. I'm usually factoring that in already.
Mm-hmm. Rob, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, everything he said there makes sense, and also to Bale's point earlier, if you did have a 500 at bat sample against the pitcher, yeah, it's relevant. I mentioned BVP because you tend not to have those sample sizes. You just even if a guy's face the same pitcher within the division over the course of many years, I think of David Ortiz, for example, facing certain pitchers, you end up at like 60 to 80 at bats, which is still irrelevant. To Sean's point, I tend to do things a little bit differently than Sean, and that's not an indictment on him. Everybody has just different methods, but my models tend to be the same. So I do everything at the player level for my betting purposes. So that also applies to DFS as well. So when I get a projection on a game in terms of betting, and I can come up with a total on a game and a spread and so on and so forth, my player projections are going to match those exactly. I do agree with what Sean said as well, though, about the usage situation that he brought up there. And I know a lot of people use tools like StatMuse, and when this guy's out of the lineup, project me the points on this player and so on and so forth. Like none of that is really predictive. There's you have such small samples most of the time, and you're better off doing things the way Sean does and trying to find out how, maybe the absence of a star player affects the usage of everyone else on a team, and so on and so forth. So for looking for other ways to do things that don't require you using a small sample like that.
Mm-hmm. All right. So Bales, earlier you had mentioned that when you use Vegas for DFS, what you're looking at more is the way that people use Vegas as opposed to the way that you actually think that games might go. Can you talk a little bit more about how you are looking at Vegas in DFS and how DFS players are reacting to the Vegas data that they see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people are just one thing that's really relevant is how frequently Vegas can be right on certain things. So, like I said, in baseball, they might be right to project a team at 5 runs, but that in a single game, the outcomes are going to be all over the place. They could score 15 runs, they could score 1. So if people are treating that with the same level of consistency as, say, the Warriors and their team total, then that's a situation to exploit. Another thing I look at is money line betting percentages that really have just started to look at that. I found is predictive of DFS ownership, even after you adjust for the public generally betting on favorites, for example, and of course those favorites in certain sports at least are going to be higher owned. Even after correcting for that, you see higher ownership on just players on teams that are getting a large percentage of money line or spread bets. So that's something that I've looked at more and more over the past year, really trying to predict ownership.
Mm-hmm. Now, Sean, so when you're not projecting, you are creating DFS lineups and playing in contests. How do you kind of transition from using Vegas for projections to looking at the way that people are using Vegas for DFS purposes?
Pretty much what Bales said. If you see something like a team total of 5 for the Red Sox and 4.5 for the Astros, I think people they underappreciate the volatility in those projections. I think people take Vegas team totals too much at face value, and they don't really think of the big picture of a bell curve of expected runs. So I think I definitely look at, especially with football, when it comes to Saints games, people like to load up on the Saints and their opponent when they're at home, which makes sense. But that their ownership percentages are going to be through the roof. So I tend to look at value just beneath that. I think you don't have to be crazy contrarian, but you can just take the secondary highest team total, and you can get some decent ownership percentages there. But I think people do incorporate Vegas a lot more these days than, a few years ago than DFS. So I've been trying to shift in that regard.
All right. And then, and Rob, so I think it's interesting because, so with Prediction Machine, and then as a professional sports bettor, you're looking to do one thing, but then maybe as a DFS player, you would be looking to do something different with Vegas data. What are your thoughts on how to, I guess, how to use it in DFS and how that might differ from how you would be using it as a bettor?
Yeah, I think Jonathan and Sean brought up some great points and how you can really use that data to, in a lot of tournament play and GPP play, and just to, find stacks, for example. I'm a Canadian. I do a lot of hockey GPPs, a lot of hockey DFS, but Bales made a great point about the correlation between high money line percentages, public splits, and just people stacking favorites. And a lot of times what I'll notice is, you can find a game with a high total, for example, and maybe grab the underdog in that game and stack those players on certain lines, and they'll be very low owned. So, it's just finding that sweet spot, so to speak, where you still have a high chance, or not a high chance, but some, chance of good output from the players, with the expectancy that not a lot of other people are going to own those players based on money lines, high team totals in games, and all the stuff that was brought up by Sean and Jonathan.
Mm-hmm. And one thing that also can factor into this that I don't think we've mentioned yet, but so there's the level of ownership, which is like the market of DFS players, but then there's also like the level of the salaries with the platform setting them, and those salaries might not be efficient either. And in some cases, they could be influenced by, even if it's not what they see with Vegas, it could be correlated with Vegas data. So there could be multiple, like different markets to try to leverage in different opportunities. So Sean, a question here: for the purposes of DFS, what Vegas data do you think matters, and then which data it doesn't matter, or like even worse than that, like which data is dangerous?
We've kind of hit on it, but the team totals are obviously important. But on the same side, they're kind of detrimental because people take them a bit too far. So it's both sides of the coin here, where people are using the correct data, but sometimes they're misusing it. And I see this too with player prop markets. People maybe put a little too much weight in player props. They just think, oh, sportsbooks are offering this, so they're really sharp, and they're meant to be some really accurate prediction, but they don't realize there isn't as many sharp bettors, or there isn't as much volume in player props. So I think people definitely take them a little bit too much at face value. And sharp DFS players like you guys are better off betting on those than really incorporating those into your DFS decisions, really. So that's one piece of data that I've noticed people using a little too heavily. But it's always good to be aware of those things. It's just I think people take a lot of the team totals and player props a little bit too far.
Mm-hmm. And Rob, I see you nodding your head there in agreement with the player props. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's like me and Sean are sharing the same brain here. Player props markets are, there's very low limits on player props. Sportsbooks don't spend a whole lot of time setting lines for player props. They're largely inefficient. I have this argument with my friends all the time, but like strikeout props in baseball, I'll have friends that use those to project strikeouts for pitchers, and they're meaningless, that they're not sharp at all. I think player props is something that people should definitely avoid. They're very soft markets. They can be exploited. But the reason that they're not is because the limits are so small. Professional bettors don't really want to waste their time on player props when they can bet sides and totals of games for, 40, 50 times the bet amounts and not have their limits lowered either. So I completely agree with everything Sean said there. I think a lot of people will look to props to sort of lead them in the right direction, but props markets are very soft and they should try to avoid those at all costs.
Mm-hmm. Well, kind of going off of that, what are some of the other Vegas bets that you think are most exploitable, and maybe especially for you, given the way that you think and the knowledge of different sports that you have? But I think you're still muted.
Thank you. What you're going to tend to find is, the markets that have lower limits are the more exploitable markets, and that's it's unfortunate that that's the way it works out, but that's the way it is. So player props, they're very exploitable. For someone who's maybe like a college student or doesn't take betting, doesn't want to be a pro bettor, that's something that they could definitely exploit rather easily over the long term. They're very soft. Futures markets as well. You can't get a ton of money down on futures teams to win the Super Bowl or, who's going to win the NBA championship and so on and so forth. But you can do a lot of line shopping. You can find great prices. A lot of people don't want to do that because a lot of futures, maybe you're only going to win 10% of the time. You bet a team at 10-1, that's an implied probability of about 9%. You might have a small edge there, but you keep doing that over time, and eventually you're going to hit a big one and cash on one of those. So, where you tend to see smaller limits on bets, that's where sportsbooks know that they can get exposed. That's why those smaller limits are in place. Those are markets that you could take advantage of. It's much tougher to beat sportsbooks on spreads and money lines and totals. Limits are a lot higher. They focus a lot more of their efforts on there, and because of that, there's a lot of pros betting into those markets as well. So as soon as there's an inefficiency, it gets snapped up right away. You see it in the NBA. As soon as LeBron James is announced out in a game, the line's gone within 10 seconds, or the sportsbook quickly pulls it down. You don't really have a chance to grab those inefficiencies, whereas in player props and futures, you really do. There are sportsbooks out there that won't update their futures for an entire week. And a lot of stuff changes in the course of a week. Teams lose a few games or win a few games, and there's opportunities to be had there for sure.
Bales, when you're not betting on yourself in feats of strength or athletic competitions, what are the bets that you think are most exploitable?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's props for sure. So I don't know that I need to go into it too much more. That these guys covered it pretty well, but there's just there's not a great incentive for the books to emphasize having accuracy in those over an NFL spread or something. In terms of maybe like Vegas data that can be exploited, I think that how the DFS sites price and how they're using it. So like in golf, the salaries on DK are basically like a mirror image of Vegas. So using Vegas doesn't make probably a ton of sense. And then you could also look at like ways that fantasy production might deviate from the Vegas line. So even if they're accurate, in golf, you have some guys who maybe are a little bit more volatile, and they'll go like birdie bogey, as opposed to 4 pars, which is fundamentally different. They're just more aggressive. Or in football, maybe a team throws a bunch of like quick screens or whatever, and the wide receivers get more points in PPR, even if that's not reflected in the line. So there's things like that I think are probably exploitable.
All right, so I think you've touched on this, but I'd like to get some more Bales wisdom here. So in GPPs, there's always an edge to be gained by being intelligently contrarian. So how do you think that Vegas data can be leveraged in a contrarian way? Like, how are you looking to do that?
Yeah, I think so. Sean had a good point about sort of fading the top projected team. It does depend. It really does depend on the sport. But fading the top projected team and looking at those second tier teams, often they'll be just like slightly less, slightly reduced probability of them doing well that you're taking on for dramatically lowered ownership, which is obviously a good situation. Rob also talked about underdogs. Depends on the sport, but for the most part, I think I've personally played way more underdogs than the average DFS player. Love to play underdogs on quarterback, receiver, tight end, pass catching running backs on underdogs that are still projected well. People just tend to look at a team total. So if a team's projected at 24 and they're projected to lose, they're going to have lower ownership than if they're projected to win by 7 points, even though the game script's actually better for them in the former scenario. So, again, thinking about how other people are using Vegas in a superficial way, and then just trying to beat that.
Mm-hmm. Sean, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think we've all hit the nail on the head with this. But another aspect of that, I guess, that I sort of factor in is a lot of people, for NBA, factor in the blowout potential, maybe a little bit too much. So when they see the Vegas lines minus 11 for a team, they just go, well, the team's going to blow them out. But they don't realize that, well, there's a 50% chance it's going to be a single-digit game. And I guess it depends on the team and the coach how they handle blowout time. But I found it's pretty easy to be contrarian when the line's double digits in NBA. I think people often too much fade a guy due to the blowout scare. So that kind of stems with my take that people take the line maybe too much at face value, and they don't really get that, it's just an estimate, and there's a certain level of volatility involved in it. So I guess that's one way I kind of exploit it. But we all hit the nail on the head on, the team totals. People tend to gravitate towards the highest team total where, they might be a little too high owned, and they're going to be priced accordingly. The Saints, Warriors, they all have high team totals because we already know they're good and they're high scoring teams. So that's pretty much redundant, piggybacking that with the team total being high.
Mm-hmm. Rob, some thoughts here on how to be contrarian in GPPs while leveraging Vegas data.
Yeah, just an example I can give, and it's something that I'm using this week, but Bales talked about the way that golf salaries are made, and early in the week, golf salaries come out on DK, and they're pretty much right in line with the betting markets on salaries. But as the week goes on, the betting markets change. People start to bet certain golfers. The odds tend to move, and the majority of people are putting in their lineups on Wednesday night or Wednesday during the day, Thursday mornings early on, and they're leveraging that data now. And, when you're playing GPPs, you can find guys that are clearly going to be owned just because their salary on DK doesn't correlate nicely to their salary, their market price. So you see that every week where you get guys in golf tournaments that are 30 to 40% owned, which is I tend to fade those guys. It's been successful for me. So I think you can really look at the betting markets for golf futures, golf tournaments later on in the week, how they moved, and identify guys that are going to stand out right away, and you'll see them. They'll be like, well, this guy's priced at 7,500 on DK and he's 20 to 1 in real life. Everyone's going to own that guy because they've identified that inefficiency in the pricing, but they haven't really applied it correctly because that's something you'd apply to a cash game and not so much to a tournament. So just little things like that, where you can use futures markets, especially in golf. Same thing for NASCAR as well. The NASCAR scoring system is very different from just winning a race. A lot of people will use NASCAR odds in projecting their NASCAR lineups, but there's a lot more that goes into it than just winning the race. So little things like that.
Yeah, this has been a real treat to talk with you guys, and just to top it off with some NASCAR wisdom right there. Guys, any closing thoughts? And let's start with Sean here. Some words of wisdom.
Yeah, so I think the main thing I want to take away from this is, in the long run, Vegas odds are very, very accurate. You're crowdsourcing a lot of the top bettors. There's a lot of money involved. The lines themselves are going to be very sharp over the long run. But when it comes to DFS, you have to understand the volatility involved in it. And so short term, I think people probably estimate and overweight Vegas odds when it comes to, people flocking to a team with a high team total. So I think people just need to understand that long-term Vegas odds are going to be accurate, but short term, you need to kind of take advantage of people sort of overestimating the day-to-day accuracy in them.
Rob.
Yeah, just a few things. So one from the DFS perspective, I think a lot of times applying odds and using odds will give you, you're better off using it in terms of going contrarian rather than using it in your favor, so to speak. You're better off using it and trying to project what other people are going to do rather than using it for your own purposes, since everyone else has access to that data and everyone else is using it. This is stuff that's, widely known. So that's the first point. The second, I just have to say it because we've been saying it all podcasts or vodcasts, but I hate the usage of Vegas odds, since Vegas is just essentially copying offshore odds. So I just had to throw it out there because it's a pet peeve of mine, constantly saying Vegas odds. And I know my friends they'll ether me for this, for the amount of times I've said Vegas odds in this podcast. And just the last point, and it's not so much fantasy, but the whole notion that, Vegas knows and they have some sort of secret sauce that, it's not true. Like, bettors shape the market, and that's what people need to understand. Offshores, Vegas, they put out a line with very low limits on it. They use the action from early on and from sharper bettors early on to shape that line. So there's just sort of this misconception of how the betting market works. And I think Sean touched on this in the first question, but it's something that people really need to understand and really need to know, that they really don't have that much of an edge over somebody who really knows what they're doing. So for any sports bettors out there or people who like to model, that should be some encouragement for you to, do what you're doing and track what you're doing and test what you're doing, because there are ways to exploit the betting markets.
Great stuff there. Bales, closing thoughts.
I just say, think about what your goals are as a DFS player, and that will probably dictate how you use Vegas data. If you're trying to be as accurate as possible, or figure out the most likely thing to happen, then it probably makes more sense. And that would be cash games for the most part, head-to-heads. If it's not like that, you're playing GPPs and trying to exploit how other people are thinking, knowing that pretty much every DFS player, even novice DFS players, are looking at Vegas, then it's just not going to have as much use. And in fact, it probably has, in some instances, negative value, where you're going to want to either fade it or just find ways that it doesn't correlate to fantasy production or fantasy upside, or is improperly reflected in ownership percentages.
All right, guys, this was awesome. I think this is maybe the favorite Roundtable show of mine so far, and appropriately, it's, I think, number 21. So that's a good Vegas or offshore, as we would say, number. Guys, thank you for being on the show. We've been speaking with Sean Koerner, Rob Pasola, and Jonathan Bales. You can follow them on Twitter at _oddsmaker, Rob Pizzola, and Bales Football. And you can follow me on Twitter at MattFTheOracle. I'm Matthew Freedman, and this has been the Daily Fantasy Sports Roundtable, brought to you by FantasyLabs. Thanks for tuning in.